Good evening. This is Anthony Miller, Special Districts Manager with the City of Oxnard, presenting draft maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts to the Public Works and Transportation Committee for March 25th, 2025. Recommendation: that the Public Works and Transportation Committee, 1, provide final recommendations on the draft policy sections, and 2, recommend staff present a maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts to the City Council for consideration. Background: the Special Districts Division within the Public Works Department is responsible for the management of the city's bonded assessment districts, landscape maintenance districts, LMDs, community facilities districts, CFDs, maintenance assessment districts, MADs, and waterways assessment districts, WADs. Each of these district types is governed by different provisions of state law, which govern the purposes for which they can be formed, basic administrative requirements, and the processes by which their assessments and special taxes can be levied. Out of these various assessment districts, the LMDs were formed under the provisions of the Landscape and Lighting Act of 1972, Streets and Highways Code Sections 22500 et sequitur, the 1972 Act, and must comply with specific management requirements unique to the 1972 Act. On February 25th, staff introduced various concepts and draft policy text examples for the committee to discuss and provide feedback and recommendations. While inflation continues and the costs of goods and services increase, having a policy in place will help provide direction to staff and to avoid other LMDs from also becoming underfunded or potentially run into a deficit. Specific items which required further input have been brought back to the committee as a part of this report. Discussion: although the proposed policy will not address the specific impact LMDs have on their neighborhoods or explain their specific function, public comment and committee discussion has showed the value of briefly addressing these topics. LMDs exist to provide a direct and special benefit to those who choose to purchase property within its boundaries. The additional level of landscaping, amenities, parks, lighting, and/or other authorized improvements within the district that are above and beyond what is generally provided to residents through the typical planning and permitting of non-LMD developments. For example, this is an example of a general fund paseo, and this on the right is an example of an LMD paseo. Additionally, this is an example of a neighborhood entrance. LMD maintained items within the red highlighted area include the sign, turf, planters, trees, irrigation systems, and sidewalks. An example of a general fund neighborhood entrance, highlighted in red. The only items that are cared for by the general fund in this particular area are the shrubs within the planter, directly in front of the Oceana sign. Many of the city's LMDs were formed prior to the passing of Proposition 218 in 1996. This means that an LMD is formed without an inflator. Any future increases in operating expenses for items such as landscape services or utilities cannot be met unless they are able to reduce services or eliminate improvements within that district. This specifically means reducing or canceling services entirely in order to stay within the LMD's funding capacity. To put this in terms that may be more familiar, the highest assessed rates within the past 5 years have been broken into a monthly payment to show what an equivalent homeowners association payment would be with similar improvements. This information is shown in Table 1 within the staff report. The LMDs highlighted within Table 1 are specifically at risk for substantial swings in maintenance quality as they become unable to fund their improvements because of inflation and their capped pre-Prop 218 fixed rates. This is already happening in some LMDs where maintenance and operations expenses are exceeding the LMD's capacity to fund them. Districts that are classified as underfunded or deficient are indicated within Table 2 in the staff report and on the map included as Attachment 3 to the staff report. This information is not meant to determine any ideal assessment amount, but rather illustrate the scope and scale of services provided in comparison to what the highest assessment amounts represent as a portion of each unit and property's total tax bill. Proposition 218, an amendment to the state constitution that was adopted by voters in 1996, dramatically reduced the city's ability to increase assessment rates in existing LMDs. Prior to the adoption of Prop 218, the City Council could each year adopt increases to assessment rates without holding any sort of property owner election. The LMDs established prior to the adoption of Prop 218 were approved by the City Council without the concept of a maximum rate or an automatic inflation adjustment. At the time these LMDs were established, it was assumed that the rates could easily be adjusted each year to meet increasing or special costs. Prop 218 introduced changes that effectively moved the goalpost for communities formed prior to Prop 218's passage. The city currently has 10 LMDs that were formed prior to the passage of Prop 218, each of which has a capped assessment. This list can be found within Table 3 as a part of the staff report. Once Prop 218 went into effect, the currently applied rate for the assessment in connection with each of these grandfathered LMDs became the maximum rate for the LMD. LMDs created after 1996 included a property owner-approved annual adjustment to the maximum rate. It is also important to note that the applied rate is annually recommended by staff and approved by the City Council and is less than or equal to the maximum rate. Pursuant to Prop 218, to change an LMD's maximum rate, the city must conduct an assessment mail ballot proceeding. The purpose of this policy is to address areas where the Streets and Highways Code, Government Code, and Prop 218 does not provide explicit guidance on the processes and procedures for the city to follow. Neither Prop 218 nor the 1972 Act require that a city conduct any sort of polling or resident outreach prior to preparing an engineer's report, proposing an assessment, or mailing notices and ballots to property owners. Although not required, it makes sense to do outreach or polling prior to beginning the formally required process, as there are significant costs associated with preparing an engineer's report and conducting a mail ballot proceeding. Staff has dedicated a substantial portion within the draft policy specifying procedures for initiating polling prior to the commencing steps required by state law for an increase. The draft policy will also include procedures for the conduct of the mail balloting required by Prop 218 in order to set the ground rules for balloting well ahead of the conducting of a balloting. Polling and balloting is subsequently the first item that requires consensus from the committee. The following table includes specific policy text examples that highlight different versions that committee members supported. Operative text included from the February 25th discussion is highlighted in yellow. Sections highlighted in orange signify items that staff strongly recommends, even though the committee did not include these items in the previous discussion. The committee must also note that changes to the text in either column may affect other policy tables that are further along in the discussion. For this reason, staff recommends no significant alterations of either option. This is Table 4 within the staff report and includes a discussion on two different versions of text that affects the specific process established to initiate polling and balloting within a district. Text on the left indicates items that are supported by committee member Basua, committee member Turan, and that are staff recommended. Items on the right are alternative language from other agencies with LMDs and includes concepts that were discussed but not necessarily recommended by the committee members. Items in yellow are the specific text sections that change the operation of the actual policy when put into place. This is further text within this section of the policy. And this is the rest of the text within this section of the policy. Again, items in yellow indicate items that specifically affect the implementation of this specific section of policy and may require discussion by the committee. Items in orange are staff recommended, and regardless of which side of text the committee recommends included in the policy, the items in orange staff recommends are included either way. In the event that an LMD has a projected negative fund balance, the proposed policy should provide direction on a process that is allowed under the Streets and Highways Code. As defined within Streets and Highways Code sections 22656 and 22657, the city may carry over any surplus or deficit within an LMD to the following fiscal year. When a deficit is projected, Staff noted two competing directions during the previous committee meeting. As with the previous section, highlighted items indicate operative text and staff recommendations. This is Table 5 within the LMD Fund Balance Deficit Contribution section of the staff report. Text on the left was supported during the previous committee meeting by Committee Member Basua, Committee Member Turan, and his staff recommended. Text on the right indicates text that was considered to be supported by Committee Chair MacArthur. Items highlighted in yellow, again, are operative text, and items highlighted in yellow may have corresponding text in both columns. And items highlighted in orange are specifically recommended text items that staff recommends if the text on the left is adopted. Continuing with an LMD funding questions, this section focuses on LMD reserves and their different types. This section speaks specifically to operating reserves, which are explicitly allowed under Streets and Highways Code Section 22569. Operating reserves are differentiated from improvement reserves in that they are not collected to fund specific projects or improvements, but may be included when calculating a LMD's assessment. The following samples indicate two options to choose from to govern the generation of operating reserves. Both examples presented here comply with the language within Streets and Highways Code Section 22569. As with the previous section, highlighted items indicate operative text and staff recommendations. This is Table 6, dealing with funding and operating reserve guidance within the staff report. There was no indicated preference between Committee Chair MacArthur and Committee Member Turan on either of these sections. Supporters of the text on the left included Committee Member Basua. Staff recommends the selection of text on the right. This section of text is quite important in the development of operating reserves within an LMD. For example, the text on the left. Staff has recommended that if a minimal operating reserve is established and that it is not a requirement for any district, that the percentage for an operating reserve be set somewhat higher than the 16.6% amount that the city uses for its operating reserve guidelines. So that way, an LMD may be better prepared to respond to unexpected events or have more money set aside for unexpected events than most LMDs might have to, because LMDs with smaller budgets will have a much smaller operating reserve dependent upon this percentage. For the text on the right, staff has written this to include a concept of a range. So there are two separate sections here, one for fully funded districts and the other for underfunded or deficient districts. City staff is in both sections recommending that this is a reserve goal. The first section for fully funded districts be a reserve floor of 16.6% and a reserve ceiling of 47.4% as allowed by the Streets and Highways Code. And for underfunded or deficient districts, staff recommends that this is a goal and not a requirement, and that it is no less than 16.6% if possible, and then not to exceed 47% if they are able to fund to that level. It should be noted that during the calculation of these reserve amounts, Streets and Highways Code Section 22659 states that any direct payment to an LMD must be factored into the calculation of the following year's assessment. This includes instances such as when Mr. Blattell identified certain sidewalk grinding services should not have been billed to his LMD. The reimbursement of those costs must be factored into the calculation of the following year's assessment to include any reserve amounts needed for operating or improvement purposes. The difference between the above sections, while minor, have a substantial impact. A lower operating reserve percentage can make budgeting for LMDs with capped maximum levies easier, as less funds may be needed to be set aside prior to budgeting for regular maintenance and operations. This can also be achieved by using specific language, such as specifying a reserve goal rather than a requirement. Separate from operating reserves, LMDs may also hold reserves for specifically identified projects in accordance with Streets and Highways Code Section 22660. These improvement reserves, as staff has defined them, may be collected over a period not to exceed 5 years. This is a very important differentiation, as it encourages the city to periodically review projects within the LMDs and their ability to fund longer-term projects. The inability to fund larger projects, even when expenses are spread across a 5-year window, may indicate a need for an LMD to be balloted. Continuing within the funding category, staff also seeks specific consensus on how to prioritize funding decisions within LMDs when projected expenses exceed revenues and reserves may no longer be sufficient to cover the difference. To facilitate this, staff defined 2 LMD funding states: underfunded, meaning unable to fund both operating reserves and maintenance operations, and deficient, unable to fund operating reserves, maintenance operations, and are projected to end the fiscal year with a fund balance deficit. Any LMD may move from being fully funded to underfunded in a very short time frame dependent upon the size of their budget, potential mid-year increases in costs, such as a change in landscape contractor, and whether or not operating and improvement reserves are required to be funded. Staff is strongly recommending that identifying a maximum assessment as a policy option be included so as not to potentially exclude that tool from future usage if needed. As with the previous section, highlighted items indicate operative text and staff recommendations. This is Table 7, dealing with funding priorities when expenses exceed revenues within the staff report. Staff did not recognize an indicated preference from Committee Chair MacArthur, and supporters of the text on the left included Committee Member Basua, Committee Member Turan, and his staff recommended. Text on the right is alternative language from other agencies with LMDs and includes concepts that were discussed but not necessarily recommended by the committee members. Again, yellow text indicates the operative section within this particular policy section, and orange text includes specific staff recommended text be included regardless of support from either the left or the right columns. This is the remainder of this text section. Continuing on. The previous policy items signify the remaining items needed for staff to complete a fully defined LMD maintenance and funding policy. When consensus is reached on the above items, staff will incorporate this feedback and recommend bringing the full document to the City Council for discussion and approval. There is no direct financial impact associated with this action. Any questions?